Hey everyone, Philip Goodback here again. This is a continuation of my book, Ignited by the Bottle, Delivered by the Fist. This is chapter 4 in video format, obviously. And when I've completed doing the video um, part of my book, I will obviously transcribe it, and it'll be edited and re-edited and put into a complete book format. So this video is chapter 4. And the title of this video is Me and Grandpa. My grandfather, my father's father, who lived with us until I was 11. He passed away when I was 11. And but before I get into that, I want to give you a bit of an idea of what life was like at uh, at this point in time. And I would have been, let's say, I can really remember being, and really interacted with Grandpa from the age of 5 and 6 and so on. And then on up until he passed away when I was 11, but I was very, very close to him. But the way life was like, there was a lot of tension and stress um, in our daily life. You're always, as a kid, you're always wondering what was going to happen next. The ongoing arguments and fights between my parents and stuff. And quite often, like I've said before in previous videos, over the same sort of stuff. But they were very volatile, often violent, and quite often when my father spoke, whatever he spoke, every second word was a swear word. And when my mother would say to him, Jack, could you stop swearing? He'd just swear all the more, almost like a little boy type thing, And he didn't give a damn who he swore in front of too. I can remember one time when around at the shopping centre around on the North Shore, a place called Takapuna, he got out of the car and he was swearing like a trooper as he got out of the car, and the people walking along the sidewalk as well, and but he just couldn't care. He just couldn't care less, But it was very embarrassing. His type of behaviour was very embarrassing. And of course, the stress and tension, like I said, became violent, and quite often not only to my mother but also to myself and my siblings as well. So that was what our daily life was like. And I can remember when I was in Standard 2, I was around about 9 years old. I can remember sitting in my classroom where it was in a prefabricated building and so on. I remember sitting in my classroom and looking around at my classmates. And all I was thinking was, I wonder what their life is like. I wonder what their reality is like. And they've got no idea what mine is like. Of course, fast forward, when you get later, behind closed doors, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what anybody's real life, that real reality is like that they're living, going through, suffering through. But a light spark, I guess, at that point in my life when I was 9 years old, is I had a girl, and her first name was Alison, and kids in the classroom used to call her Mrs. Good, right? They all thought, oh, you guys will get married, like your boy and girlfriend. It's at 9 years old. It was quite a sweet and bit of light, in amongst the darkness. But like I say, this chapter is mainly about myself and my grandpa. And I was his mate. He was not even my grandfather, but I've always considered him to be my real father. Sure, my dad did his bit with my mother and so on, so it produced me, right? But that's about all it was. And he was a provider to a point, right? But, when they say, a father could be a provider and protector, we always, as kids, and my mother, we needed a protector from our protector. We needed a protector to protect us from our protector, right? But it didn't happen, did it? And so all the time we were on the receiving end, verbally, emotionally, and physically. But my grandpa, the reason I guess, the episode when I was, in the first video I did, in chapter 1, when my father knocked me out of my high chair when I was 11 months of age, sent me flying across the dining room floor. I guess, obviously, I'm not sure whether my grandfather was there and saw that or we just told about it afterwards, but he knew about it. And I don't know whether he's, or from that point onwards, or, feeling sad or bad for me or whatever. He took an extra interest in me, or because I was the firstborn of 6 kids, I was sort of the eldest. So, and obviously he would obviously have seen there was a bit of a there was a bit of a conflict between myself and my dad. I don't know about we talk about love hate, but I don't think it was love hate. I think it was pretty much hate, unfortunately. Yeah, I think I hated my dad from a very, very young age, probably from the time he knocked me out of a high chair, probably at 11 months of age. And over the years, I didn't have anything really to change my opinion either. Unfortunately, right to the end of his life when I was in my early 50s. But so my grandfather took an extra interest in me, I guess. And so when my grandfather, Good's wife, my grandmother, who I didn't know, she actually had a heart attack and died or passed away when she was 50, well before I was born. So I didn't know her at all. So my grandfather was on his own for a lot of years, never remarried, never even thought about remarrying. He was a one-woman man. That was it. And so, of course, he would whenever he would go shopping, and if I was 5 or 6 years of age, he was home from school or whatever, and or on a weekend, he'd go down to the local shops down in Birkenhead in the North Shore, and when he got dressed up, he looked really, really smart, really, really handsome, because he was in his 3-piece suit and a tie, and of course he had his hat on, how they used to wear in those days. My grandfather also was born on 31st of March, 1889. 1889, right? So he's born not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. Long time ago. And what I worked out is about 136 years ago. If my grandfather was alive today, it'd be 136. But yeah, so he could jump up in his finery, and we'd hop on a bus and go down to Birkenhead. And he'd be holding my hand and be walking along, and I would be, say, 6 years of age. And out of the shops, out of the shops down in Birkenhead, because my grandpa, because Birkenhead wasn't a big town, and right from the early days, pretty much everybody knew him. He knew everybody, particularly those in business as well, because he owned a trucking business, you see. So he was a carrier. He used to cart goods to people into businesses. And he did residential shifts as well, house shifts, house removals as well. That was part of the services he provided. But I used to go down there, and and I knew when we went shopping down in Birkenhead, it was going to be quite a long period of time, right? Because every shopkeeper to a person would come out of the shops and say, "How are you going today, Mart? How are you, Mart?" And my grandfather would tip his hat, to men, or particularly to ladies, and that, and they'd have a big conversation, and this happened not just with one businessman, one shopkeeper, but pretty much every one of them. Everybody seemed to know my grandpa, and I couldn't work out, they seemed to regard him as some sort of a hero, and I always wondered why. And in later years, I discovered the real reason why. And in the Depression years of the 30s, leading up to the Second World War, my grandfather, like I say, had his trucking business. And quite often people would ring him up if they needed to shift home or whatever. They'd say, "Oh, Mart, we've got to move house. We've got to shift house, and but money's tight, and I can't afford to pay you your whole bill. Can I part pay you and pay the rest later?" And my grandfather would always say, "Yeah, no, there's no worries, and he'd do the job, and he said, "You just pay me the balance of the bill when you see blue skies, right?" Well, 9 times out of 10, that didn't happen. And my grandfather never followed through on following up on payments or money owed. He just let it pass, So, in really hard time, depression years, between 1930 and, leading up to the 1939 war, Second World War, he would do things and just let things ride because there were hard times, right? So if he could get by, he'd help others get by as well, and never sought the balance of payments on house removers or for anything that people couldn't afford. But he would help. So he was known for his kindness and his generosity, and people never ever forgot that. And that was the real reason why he was so much of a hero and so much of a great man, according to those people that he helped in those hard times. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, being a young kid of 6 and 7, but I realized that afterwards. And he was my hero. He was 100% was my hero. But he was a hero in every sense of the word too. Like he was loving, kind, generous, and a gentle sort of person, and totally the opposite of my father. And I couldn't understand why my father was his son. Like grandfather was his father. Why they were so different. My grandfather was totally unselfish. My father was so selfish. I couldn't work out why. And but yeah, so anyway, that was that. And other times, of course, Grandpa was very keen on the horses. So in 1889, when he went to primary school up in Dargaville in Northland, New Zealand, he would ride a horse bareback to school and then home again in the afternoon. And so he grew up with horses from very little boy to right through his life. Loved horses. And anyway, he actually ended up moving a house from point A to point B down when he moved to Auckland later on in his life, and as a young man. And he was in business with horses, and that he would harness up a 40-horse team and move a house for a prominent businessman in Auckland from point A to point B. And so that's what he was able to do. But so my grandfather loved horses, and quite often he loved going to the races, the horse races, watching the thoroughbreds race. So we used to catch a bus and go over to Ellerslie and Avondale, two race courses in Auckland, New Zealand. And we'd catch the bus over, and he would be dressed up in his three-piece suit again with his tie and his hat, and looked very, very smart. And as everybody did when they went to the races in those days, everybody was in their finery, right? It was almost like they're in their Sunday best for the races. It was a huge occasion. And one of the things one of my absolute number one memories was at lunchtime, right? At lunchtime, they'd have, just down below, we'd sit up in the stand and watch the races and stuff, then go down. And at lunchtime, there were all these tables just out in the open air. And they would bring people, like people that were, I guess they had a bakery or whatever, somewhere where they baked, but there were literally, it seemed to be, to me as a little boy, there seemed to be hundreds of pies there, and they're all in brown paper bags, At lunchtime, they're all out there, and people would be buying them left, right, and centre, And I can remember, my eyes would stick out, I thought, wow, look at all those pies. And of course, Grandpa and I would get our pie, and Grandpa go and put his bed on a horse and stuff, and then we go up in the stand, eat our pie, and we get a bit of a drink as well, and so on. So, but those were very, very special occasions. And so, the time that I spent with my grandfather, and my father didn't really want to spend any time with me at all, or my siblings actually as well. And so, of course, time. What does time mean? To invest my essence. Time is love. If you really love somebody, really deeply love somebody, you want to spend as much time with them as possible. My grandfather, with my wife, with my children, my grandchildren. I want to be around them. I want to spend as much time as I can with them. The people I love, unconditionally, just by being in their presence. is so wonderful, fabulous, sensational. It's hard to explain, but I guess a lot of you guys that know what love is, and particularly unconditional love, like the love you have when you greet your newborn baby when it's first born. That sort of outpouring of unconditional love. That's the sort of love that I mean. Anyway, so those were very, very memorable times, beautiful times, and memories that I treasure forever. And all as I got older, much older, and have got married and had my own children, and then grandchildren, it made me even more so regret what I missed out, what both my father and I missed out on. We missed out on spending quality time together, and my siblings did as well. Quality time together because I could, in all the years, I left home when I was 18, but every school holiday I was away working from the age of 12 through to 18. It was really, it was not only to earn money through working, but it was really to get away from home and get away from my father and the environment that we lived in. But so so I spent a lot of my time with my grandfather and stuff, and I'll continue on in the next video actually, because this video is up to 16.5 minutes, so I'll end this and start up another one. But the next thing I want to talk about is me and grandpa going to the farm. His best friends, Lil and Claude. I used to call them Auntie Lil and Uncle Claude. And they bought a little farm, and that, it was mainly a poultry farm, but they had that 23, 24 dairy cows as well, and some ducks and so on, ducks on the side too. So, and they were my grandpa's best friends. They lived down to where my grandfather lived in Hinamara Street in Birkenhead, and they lived sort of just up the road from where he lived before they sold up and bought a farm up at Riverhead, just north of Auckland. So my next video will be about that, and the great times I spent on the farm with Grandpa and Auntie Uncle Claude. And so we'll continue then. So it's like the times with my grandfather was like, it's like the light in amongst all the darkness, I guess. And he was very much the headlight, if you like, the shining star in amongst the darkness. And myself and my siblings, my three brothers, my two sisters, unfortunately, they didn't get to know my grandpa because he was dead by the time they were born. But he was a wonderful, wonderful man, and I really treasured my time with him. And like I say, he was a light in the darkness. A lot of darkness in those early years, and even more when my grandpa passed when I was 11. Totally, my grandfather, just had an effect on my father, sort of keeping the lid on things to a point, not absolute control, no way. My father was out of control, but things got totally worse and much more out of control once he passed when I was 11. Anyway, I'll get on to talking about that in subsequent chapters. So I'll leave it at that. Love you guys. Hope you're having a fabulous day. Love you all. Talk to you soon. Bye now.